for her. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we started this enterprise a few years ago, this is an experiment in democracy and also moral courage and beloved community. And Bill Swartz, my co-founder, and I, we weren't sure where this would lead. But we did know if we reached out to faith leaders that are public intellectuals and shared the same values or courage that we felt inside our souls, that maybe we were onto something. And one of those early trailblazers that gave us courage and faith and hope, his name is Dr. Drew G.I. Hart. And he will deliver our keynote today on the beloved valley, in a tradition of Martin Luther King's concept of the beloved community, which is what the valley is all about. Drew Hart, if you get a chance, I've read one of his books. He has 3 that he's written by himself, several that he's co-written, podcaster, he's always traveling. I've never met him in person before today, but I feel like I know him like a brother. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Drew G.I. Hart.
Morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Matt, for the invitation to join and participate. I want to start off with a story, but I understand the task for me is to talk a little bit about beloved community. And one of the ways I often think about beloved community is to think of it as God's dream for us, where everyone belongs, where everyone matters, where everyone can thrive. But I want to start off with a story. When I was in middle school, we went on a field trip, and on this particular field trip, in Philly, there used to be a urban mall called the Gallery, if anybody remembers and knows about that. It's no longer operative, but we had stopped there to get lunch, and we were middle schoolers, and we were paired off without any supervision to just get some exercise and move a little bit before we got back on the bus. Now you can imagine, here I am, a middle school boy, unsupervised in a mall. And so, this was a trap because, we were going to, things weren't going to necessarily work out the way probably these teachers had planned. And so we're walking through this mall and we approach an escalator. And so again, middle school boys unsupervised, there was only one thing that we could do with this escalator, which is to go up the escalator the wrong way, right? Of course. And so we begin to try to go up this escalator the wrong way, and as we began to go up and try to get to the next floor, we begin to realize a few things about going up the escalator the opposite direction. We realized very quickly that it's a little bit more work than we had initially anticipated, right? We just thought it was going to be a quick little breeze going up the other way, but it actually took some deliberateness, some intentionality, some striving to keep going and getting from one floor to the other. We also realized that as it took that intentionality and that deliberateness, that if you got a little tired and you stopped, you were still moving, right? And so we're trying to get up, but we take a little break, we're still going to be moving in a particular direction. So there is no pause if you're trying to get up the escalator the wrong way. The other thing that we learned really quickly is that we're not the only ones on the escalator, right? And so some folks are moving in the opposite direction of us, and we're actually literally navigating the flow and direction of traffic between us and them. But we were determined to get to that next floor, and so we kept striving, and we got eventually up that escalator going the opposite direction. And I often think about that experience because I think about the ways in which I have this vision for beloved community, right? What it means for us to embody a place where everyone belongs, where everyone matters, where everyone can thrive. And yet often we realize that there's other inertias, historical inertia at work that make this work challenging, that make it a requirement that we actually have some deliberateness and intentionality about how we live and what we do and what we're committed to. It requires deliberateness because this inertia, and I'll talk about it in a moment. There's histories, centuries at work shaping our current moment. And if we try to opt out as if we're just neutral players in what's going on around us, we will just be swept up in the inertia of history and the movements that have been going on for hundreds of years. And then finally, as we set our eyes and fix our eyes on this beloved community, we also then realize that we will be sometimes going against the grain, right? Sometimes we have to have a courageous counter-witness to what's going on all around us. It's not always going to be easy. Sometimes there's going to be friction and tension and challenges and obstacles. But if we fix our eyes on this vision of what we can have right here in the Valley, in Central PA, for me in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, we can begin to see this thing manifest and become more real. I think that we have a choice in many ways between a really beautiful vision of beloved community for us, or I think, if we're honest, and I say this as a devoted follower of Jesus, we have the threats of white Christian nationalism, which is in some ways the counter vision to beloved community where everyone belongs, where everyone matters, where everyone can thrive. And I think that that really is at the forefront of the decisions of where we want to be as a nation, but also even in terms of our local and regional communities, right? What are we going to be pursuing and participating in? I love in the book of Isaiah is a really fascinating book because it's technically a lot of people don't realize it was actually written at 3 different historical moments and then kind of compiled. So they talk about Isaiah like book 1, 2, and 3 of Isaiah. The first book of Isaiah was written as the Israelites are anticipating Israel coming to conquest them, and eventually there is a conquest of the northern kingdom, and they're swept up and taken off by Assyria. The second book is written during the Babylonian exile, and so there's actually this moment in which many Jews are taken into exile, and they're thinking about the struggles of being the exilic people and the frustrations and the challenges that they're facing in that moment. And then you have third Isaiah, and third Isaiah is striking because it's actually after the exile is over, they're back in the land, but things are not quite as they had anticipated. Second Isaiah is beautiful. They're anticipating this grand return and peace and shalom and everything is going to be great, and they get there and things are not quite as they had anticipated or expected. In fact, it's not even all external. Some of it's themselves, that they're mistreating each other and exploiting one another and oppressing one another and fighting and bickering, and there's division going on. And yet, what's beautiful about Isaiah, and I love in particular Isaiah 65, 17 through 25, is this vision that in the midst of the challenges that they're facing, they set their eyes on God's dream for them. They would call it in the Hebrew scriptures shalom, right? This vision where a new creation and the end of violence and strife and the end of exploitation and security and peace. It's not a negative peace, it's a positive peace where justice and joy and security and flourishing and interdependence living is possible. And I think that gives us a really helpful kind of vision for the kind of beloved community that we ought to be seeking and thriving. Again, a place where we all belong, where we all can thrive, where we all matter. But white Christian nationalism it's not just at our doorsteps. It is actively implementing and manifesting in all levels of society right now. And I do want to emphasize, maybe it's more than two-pronged, multi-pronged, but I do want to emphasize in particular 2 different ways that we see it kind of manifesting in our society right now. Certainly, we're all aware of the way that our current administration is implementing policies that are dangerous and destructive for everyone that does not look like, think like, or vote like the MAGA movement, right? And so it's a very anti-pluralism, anti-diversity, anti-thriving for all people vision for society that is really dangerous. And it is a combination of taking the name of Jesus and fusing it with a socio-cultural political movement that is seeking to grab power and shape all of society, all-encompassing into that one vision. There's a long history to this, and sometimes scholars begin by talking about the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the moral majority movement, and there are these efforts to kind of take captive of the white evangelical vote and politicize it. And so in the aftermath of getting tax exemptions withdrawn from some white conservative communities, they began to create the moral majority movement to kind of galvanize a really broad base of folks who would then support a whole range of initiatives, but usually verbally they would center it around abortion, right, as the thing. And that all of a sudden, out of nowhere in the 80s, became the supposed marching point. But it became a rallying point for then a whole range of conservative politics. But I actually want to, if I can teach just for a quick moment, offer a much bigger history that actually makes some of these realities even more deeply ingrained than even just a few decades old story. If we go back to I do a lot of church history, and the first 300 years of the church lived on the margins of society. They didn't have political power. They didn't dominate. In fact, they couldn't even fathom the empire working on their behalf. And yet they were on the ground within their local communities, known for and sometimes made fun of the fact that there were enslaved people and women who were so prominent in the life of these little communities. They were known for service, for caring for the poor, caring for the sick within their communities. And then Constantine, an emperor in the 4th century, comes to power, and he begins to advantage the church. He ends Christian persecution, and he begins to give advantages to the church, and he's throwing money and big basilicas to them and all these things. And so the church is moving from the margins to the center of society. Then around 380 AD, you have an emperor named Theodosius, who literally makes Christianity the official religion of the land, right? This merger begins, so you have this church that's moving from the margins to the center and going from persecuted at times to sometimes now becoming the persecutors of others. As generations and centuries continue on, all of a sudden, you get to around like 800 AD, and you've got like Charlemagne, right? He's this really powerful Frankish king, and the Pope wants to like regain the political power of the old Roman Empire because it had kind of faded at that point. And he sees that this guy's got a lot of military power, and so he crowns him the emperor, basically, of the new Roman Empire. And there's this connection, once again, between church and state. And now they're violently going in conquest, coercively forcing people to accept Jesus. And if they don't, right, they experience violence. And in many ways, that medieval Christianity that was birthed at that time has deeply, deeply shaped so much of Western Christianity in terms of its imagination of being a top-down movement that imposes violently onto others a way of life. That continues for centuries. You have the Crusades, 1000 AD, for the next several hundred years of these Crusades. So they're legitimizing a way of seeing and interacting with those outside of Western Christendom as a way of interacting with what should be seen as their neighbors, but are being treated as enemies of the church. And then in the 1440s, Portugal begins to enslave African people. All right, so you have this Western nation, self-identified as Christian, and they begin to enslave African people. And as they begin to do that, they immediately are theologizing and justifying and claiming that it was God's sovereignty, right? And then immediately after that, you have a series of church statements, that often called the doctrine of discovery, where the church is actually justifying enslaving and plundering people's lands and such. And so a series of papal bulls are created, and literally it has the phrase in them, reduce people to perpetual slavery. And so these papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery, it's both doctrine and law simultaneously at this point, because it's church and state embedded with one another. And that encourages and allows the expansion of colonial conquests and slavery, transatlantic slave trade that impacts throughout most of Africa, the Americas, parts of Asia, right? So it's an enormous vision that's not just about evangelicalism. It's actually that there's something, as Willie Jennings calls it, a diseased theological imagination within Western Christianity wholesale, right? That there's something wrong, that from what we see in the person, life, and teachings of Jesus Christ, and then what we see actually being embodied and practiced, you could actually say they're counter. I love Frederick Douglass says it in the appendix of his slave narrative. He says that there's nothing farther apart than the religion of this land and true Christianity. Right? In fact, he goes on, he says, I hate the slave-holding, woman whipping, cradle-robbing Christianity of this land, but I love the peaceable Christ, right? And so he's got this contrast between what is actually being lived and what we actually see in the life of Jesus. And so we have this long history in which Christianity, and there always were dissident traditions that pushed against the Waldensians and others, the Anabaptists, many traditions that pushed against and said this is not how we're supposed to relate with society and with our neighbors, right? So I don't want to say that all Western Christians participate in this. Certainly the black church emerged as a resistance to white supremacy entangled in Christianity as well. There's a lot of expressions that have emerged out of that, but there is a really dangerous vision for a top-down, coercive Christianity that is trying to reshape and power grab, and if people don't fit into their vision for proper belonging, they're excluded, and they're some people, I mean, we see it through immigration, right? The violence and inhumane way in which our siblings and our neighbors are being treated. We're seeing it as people think about gun rights and who should have access to gun rights, and the disregard for life that we see, and the way in which many lives are seen as disposable because of that. We see it in the attempts to diminish voting rights and access to voting rights, especially for black communities within our society today. There's a whole wide range of ways in which these things are being implemented. And so we need to, if there's this approach from up top, but then there's also, and I appreciate some of the framing of what's happening locally, like if we're not paying attention to what's happening at school boards and in city councils and zoning meetings and such, we'll miss that has also been an enormous site for a very long time upon which white Christian nationalism is actually being manifested in local, regional communities as well. And so it's coming from the top, but it's also coming from the bottom. And so I think that if we're going to pursue beloved community together here in the Valley, then that's going to require us to also link arms and do the work together. So I want to tell one more story before I go. So in 1963, Dr. King, they went to Birmingham, and they were in the Birmingham struggle, and Birmingham was not a place that most people wanted to go. Its nickname was Bombingham because of all the unsolved bombings targeting black churches and ministers who were involved in the civil rights movement or any kind of freedom struggle at all. And as they were going, they were not getting the kind of responses that they had wanted and desired. And on one particular occasion, they're about to hold a march, and they get an injunction against them. And they got to decide, what are they going to do now that they've got an injunction against them, and whether they should march and go against it or not. And so they bring people together to meet and to decide what they should do. And as they come together to meet, they're actually in a King's hotel room. So if you can imagine a hotel room that has, like, some have actually a living room space and then an actual extra door for the bedroom. It's that kind of thing. And they're in the living room space, and it's probably about like 10 ministers gathered together debating what they're going to do. And some of them are like, look, like, we can't just go against the injunction. I'm not just trying to go to jail in Birmingham for no reason. And others are saying, like, look, we've run out of bail funds. That's definitely a reason why we shouldn't just keep going on and pushing forward, because I definitely don't want to be in the Birmingham jail indefinitely, right? That's not something that I'm signing up for right now. Others are saying, well, we could at least temporarily pause it. Let's send King back out. Let's let him do some fundraising. He can raise funds like nobody else can for the movement, and then we can reboot this thing afterwards. And then there was another set of group of folks who are also concerned because they're like, look, we're all ministers, and we're not here from Burton. We're some of us from out of town. We're coming from other cities, some of them states. And so Easter weekend and Passover was coming up, and they're like, I got to be with my church. This is the most significant weekend of the religious calendar. How can I not be present with my congregation? And so they're feeling all these pressures, and they're debating, and if there's 10 people there, there's 11 different views on what they should do to move forward. And the whole time that they're talking, King is sitting there, and he's quiet. He hasn't said one word the entire time. He's just sitting there quietly, listening to all the different perspectives on what they should do. There's their, fearless leader, right? Just quiet, not saying anything at all. And then suddenly, King gets up, and he leaves the room and goes into the bedroom and closes the door. And they're like, what? I'm sure they're wondering what in the world is going on. Is he not going to lead and offer some insight in this critical moment as they're trying to figure out what to do next in this Birmingham campaign? Minutes go by, and then suddenly the door opens back up, but something is different about King now. When he was with them, you can imagine many of the pictures that you have of Dr. King. He's usually a pretty classy look, right? Black tie and shirt, and always was ready for media because he knew about how he was going to be perceived by others, and he had to represent the movement in a particular way, and that's how he was with them. But when he opened the door and came back out, he had changed his clothes. And now King was wearing blue jeans and a blue work shirt. And the moment they saw him, everybody knew exactly what that meant at that moment, right? It was time to roll up the sleeves and time to get to work, right? And so as King put on his blue jeans, it symbolized that they weren't going to avoid conflict with the injunction, that they were actually going to go against the injunction, march and fight for justice for that community, and fight for the desegregation of that community, and fight for beloved community of that community. And so my invitation for us is that we would now, as we think about what it means to not just think about beloved community, but to pursue beloved community, is that we would all put on our blue jeans, right? Let's put on our blue jeans for beloved community. Let's put on our blue jeans for justice. Let's put on our blue jeans so justice can roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Let's put on our blue jeans, right, because our neighbors, right, some are scared to leave their homes. Others have been living in terror and underfunded schools and systems for generations, and this is not new for them, right? For others, they're being targeted because of who they love or how they express themselves, and we need to create a society where everyone belongs, where everyone matters, where everyone can thrive. And so my invitation for us is that we would link arms, that we would, just like I was a little middle schooler way back when, realize that we're going to need deliberateness and intentionality, that we're going to have to set our eyes fixed on beloved community, that we're going to have to keep striving. There's no opting out of what's going on all around us because the inertia is moving regardless. And that as we do that work, right, we are going to face obstacles. We are going to have challenges and tensions and frictions. But if we keep pressing forward, we will get to that beloved community. And so my hope and my prayer for us is that we would link arms with our neighbors, demonstrating that the way of love, the way of justice, the way of hope is stronger than the way of fear. Thank you.